ABC. Will you help me give a warm welcome to David Gillian? David.
Well, good morning. This is just a particular honor for this particular church because so many families in this church have given since the inception of the children's home back in 1950. And so just knowing the decades of support, I don't know how many people know the history of the children's home, but back in, I guess it was 1949, Mr. and Mrs. Henna from Henna Chevrolet in Austin, but it used to be Round Rock Motors, had the dream of opening a children's home there in Round Rock, so they donated 112 acres of land in the center of the city, and that was the start of the children's home. The cool thing for me to look at was the newspaper clipping from September 5th, 1950, where every business in Round Rock shut down for the opening of the children's home. To me, that just doesn't happen anywhere, but for this to be so important to that community and to the Central Texas community that everybody would be there was just such a blessing. My journey with the children's home actually started in 1987. I was a 12-year-old kid, struggling, having a lot of struggles, and a lot of people didn't know what the depth of those struggles were coming from, but at that time I came to the children's home, I was getting in trouble a lot. I was getting in fights, disrespectful to adults, really disrespectful to adults, getting into a lot of trouble. But, I came to the children's home, I was pretty broken, and what people probably didn't understand was there was so much behind that brokenness. That nobody knew. Why would this kid be so disrespectful? On paper, I actually got kicked out 6 months into being at the children's home the first time. So why would this kid be such a problem? Well, what nobody knew, and nobody knew actually until 2019, until I came back into this role at the children's home, was there was so much going on behind the scenes from the moment I can remember. I remember being in my crib being scared. So some people don't realize that you can have crib memories, but I had crib memories of being scared. And, people didn't understand what was going on with my family, the things that were going on. Of course, there was physical abuse of me and my sisters, but there was psychological abuse that nobody knew about. My mom, she worked 24/7, 5 days a week because she was the only one that wasn't addicted to something. So she was trying to keep a roof over our head. My grandmother and my dad were at home, and my dad was an alcoholic, my grandmother was a pill addict, and so, they would do things that just didn't make sense. And I'd just give you some of these as examples. When I was a kid, about 4 years old, I remember my grandmother and my dad taking me out to Capitol Hill Memorial Cemetery at night, kicking me out of the car, taking my shoes, and telling me, don't step on the graves because somebody's going to get you, and driving off from Capitol Hill Memorial Cemetery. And I remember just running across that cemetery, across the graves, just trying to get to the car. And when I got to the car, I climbed up the back of the car. It was an old station wagon, jumped on and held on to the luggage rack. And the big joke was how funny it was, how hard I held on to that luggage rack. Another thing, this was a joke that was played on me that nobody told me was a joke. I was in my bed, and I was always scared of my closet, about the same age too. And so the closet's open about that much. And so I see it move. I'm like, wait a minute. And so I start freaking out. Well, somebody jumps out of my closet, and he's wearing an orange ski mask and military jacket, blue jeans, wraps me up in my blankets, runs across the hall, and I see him go into my parents' closet across the hall. So I go to running out in the living room, and I'm like, hey, somebody's in my closet. No, nobody's in your closet. Go back to bed. Well, while I was in there saying that, they went and got back in my closet, go back and get in bed, they jump out and do it again. Now, that was bad enough because nobody told me it was a joke, but when my parents didn't, or when my dad and my grandmother didn't want to take me somewhere, they would lock me in that closet. And so, as a little kid, your mind is, that guy's in here with me, and for me, there was a slide lock at the top of the closet, so I couldn't get to it. And I remember if I could get my eye out and see some light, I'd be okay. That's what I always thought. And then they got wise to that and started pushing a twin bed up against the door so I couldn't see out. But I say all of that not to say that it's pity. It's just these are the things that were going on in my life that created that 12-year-old that ended up at the children's home, right? So why would I be disrespectful to adults? Well, what were you going to do as an adult that was worse than what I was already going through? There was nothing. And I didn't have any fear of authority. So I go to the children's home. I'm there for about 6 months. During that 6 months, my grandmother passes away. And my behavior is rough enough to where I got kicked out. So I'm at home. I failed the 7th grade. And I knew that if I didn't do something, I was never going to finish school. So I called the children's home. I called my case manager. I said, can I please come back? And he called my mom and said, David just called me and asked me if he could come back to the children's home. She was like, yeah, by all means, please. So I ended up coming back to the children's home with a different heart. You know, I knew I needed the place. And actually that mentality made all the difference in the world. You know, so as I'm going through my time at the children's home, the Lord is just planting seed after seed in my life. And I didn't realize it. I didn't know what God was doing in me. But just time after time, God was just putting more and more seed into my life. So by the time I'm 18, it's time for me to leave the children's home. I'm working at an Exxon in the middle of the night, and it's a graveyard shift. And I used to carry my Bible with me to work because my boss was Muslim, and I was going to show him what a Christian was supposed to look like, not knowing that I didn't really know what that book meant. So in a graveyard shift, you get to a point where there's nothing else to do. And so I actually started opening it up and reading that Bible and reading Scripture. And I started out in the Gospels, and the Lord just started speaking to me in those Gospels. And I started falling in love with what Christ did for me. And I get to the part in Luke where there's a woman with issues of blood. She's bleeding internally. She comes up to Jesus. She touches his robe. He says, who did it? She said, it was me. He said, go and sin no more. Your faith has made you whole. And I was like, wait a minute. What's this faith thing? What does that mean? Why did she? In other words, if she believed that she would reach out and touch his robe, so Lord, if I believe that I can reach out to you, you'll heal me? And that's what it came down to that night. And you know, the cool thing about that story of the woman with issues of blood is the Lord allowed me to just think about what that meant. This woman didn't come to Jesus whole. She came to him broken. And I knew I was broken. I knew I was becoming my dad. I was already doing drugs, drinking. I started doing drugs when I was 9. So I was already moving that direction pretty heavily. And so I see her fight her way through the crowd in her brokenness. And then she gets to Jesus and he says, your faith has made you whole. And I said, Lord, can you do that for me? I'm broken. And I can tell you that the love that I experienced that night changed me forever. I mean, immediately. My friends, they didn't recognize me the next day. I mean, and it was amazing too because, you know, some of them really, really needed to know him. And I kind of broken away because of the things that they were doing. And I knew at that moment that there was things I had to do. And I didn't understand why I had to do them until later. But there was 3 things God put on my heart the night that I was saved. 1, to whom much is given, much is required. So I knew I had been healed much. I needed to be willing to do whatever he told me to do. I was going to be a house parent at the children's home. That was something the Lord put on my heart. Said, no way. Did you forget they kicked me out? You know, and so it was going to take a miracle for me to be able to go back as that. So I just put that aside, said, yeah, that must be something else you're talking about. And then I had to go forgive my family. Now, I didn't understand why that was important, but this was an act of God healing me in going and forgiving them. So I went to where my grandmother was buried, ironically, in Capitol Hill Memorial Cemetery. And she's in an unmarked grave, so I went to that gravesite, got down, forgave her, then got up in the car, drove down to South Austin. I knew that when I walked in the door, I was just going to rip the Band-Aid off and forgive my dad. And sure enough, man, I get to the house, I open the door, he's sitting right there on the couch. And I said, Dad, I know what you did to Dava and Debbie, my sisters. You know what you did to me. but I love you. I absolutely forgive you, and you'll never hear me talk about this again. And I forgave him, and I didn't understand why it was so important. I didn't know why that forgiveness piece was important until I came back into this role. And I was out, and I was sharing my story in a little church out in the middle of nowhere. And I get done sharing my story, and a mom comes up to me with her daughters. First of all, the daughter says, okay, well, does our dad have to have it together for us to forgive him? And I said, well, does Jesus say you have to have it together for him to forgive you? No. Okay, so no, he doesn't have to have it together for you to forgive him. And the mom looks me dead in the eyes with tears in her eyes and said, then how do I do it? And at that moment, the Lord gave me revelation of why I had to do it. And I said, when we forgive, we're giving back baggage that doesn't belong to us. And you're giving it back to the person it belongs to. And our tendency as people is to just reach into that bag and grab it, and the things that are too bad. You know what? I can't forgive for that. I got to reach in and grab that and start carrying it, and you put it right back on your back. Well, this goes back to what Jesus said when he was saying, hey, take my yoke upon you. Take this load upon your shoulders, because my work is easy, my burden is light. What did he come to do? He came to forgive. He was saying you can walk with a light load if you'll just walk in forgiveness. So, I forgave my dad. Amazingly, that opened the door for us to have conversations about what I went through as a kid. My dad ended up passing away from cirrhosis of the liver, but I was close to him. I was there serving him the day he died. My sisters were there serving him the day he died. And it was because of that forgiveness that opened the door for us to have those conversations. And I remember, I just had my son, Jacob, when my dad was passing away, and I was terrified of being a dad because I knew my dad didn't intend on being the dad that he was. Something went wrong, right? And I was like, well, is that in me? I don't want to be that, and I still wrestling with, Lord, have you really healed me? And so I remember that last night that my dad was conscious. He was arguing with my mom about something, and I walk into the room and I said, Dad, I love you. He looked me in the eyes and he said, son, I loved you too. I just never knew how to tell you. And I told him, I said, Dad, I'm so thankful for every mistake you ever made because I'm going to be a good dad. So, and he laid down peacefully and he was gone 2 days later. And that was the last time he spoke. But I look at all of the things that God has done since then. And me and my wife, I met my wife in 1997 in a bar and told her that I'm a man running from God. She wasn't a believer. She's like, oh, he's a Christian. It's like she didn't understand what that meant when I was running from God. And so, but she ends up, we fall in love. We've been together ever since the night we met. We've never been apart. She was going to school at UT for psychology. And that was the other thing, is being a poor kid from South Austin. I was like, oh, she's going to college. She's going to be rich. She was not. She was not. She was, if you had to pay for UT, you were not going to be rich. And I actually inherited a lot of debt somehow. I didn't know how that worked out. But anyway, I fell in love with her, And I remember holding Jacob in church for the first time. And sitting, it was his first time in church, and looking at him and thinking, man, Lord, you put this on the cross for me. I know how much I love this little boy. I can't imagine doing what you did for me. And just all of these steps of revelation. Well, year 2000, about 1999 comes around, and I talked to my wife, and I said, I feel like it's time for me to go do what the Lord put on my heart when I was saved, and that's go back to the children's home as a house parent. And she had a dog named Muffy. And that dog had been through so much with her. And you couldn't have a dog and be a house parent at the children's home. And she was like, oh, God wouldn't ask me to give up my dog. And I was like, okay. So, but I didn't say that expecting an answer. I just let the Lord work on her heart like she's done to me so many times since. One thing after another. But anyway, she's sitting there and she's praying about it. And then she gets to a point where she says, okay, Lord, if I need to let go of this dog to do this, I'll do it. Well, we had been trying to get pregnant for 3 years, with no luck. Nothing was happening. The day that we go in for our interview at the children's home, Sarah's sick. And she wakes up, I'm sick, I'm pregnant. She was like, it's so excited because she was sick. I'm like, I've never seen somebody so excited to be sick. Anyway, we go in, we didn't know for sure that she was pregnant. We go and we do the interview. We get done, and then Sarah and I go and we take a blood test, and sure enough, she's pregnant with Jacob. And the Lord just put it on our heart. If you were willing to give away this one thing, look how much more I'm willing to give back to you. And, for me, when I come back to a place like this, me and my wife ended up serving for 10 years at the children's home as house parents. And I can't tell you how many kids that we served over that time, but one of the honors that I had was talking to one of my guys, and we get together pretty often with our guys. We've been out of the children's home as house parents since 2010, but we still have conversations with those guys. And one of the things that one of the guys said was, Pop, you know why we didn't try stuff with you? And I said, no. And they said, because you were the only house parent that we knew that we couldn't say, you don't know how this feels. And because I had been in the cottage that I was raised in, and I ended up being the house parent of the cottage that I was raised in. I knew every creak in the boards. And of course, that was the other problem for the guys, is that there was nothing that they were going to try that I had not already done at that children's home. But one of the big things about me coming back today and sharing with you is I want to connect the dots of giving. Because if it wasn't for people just pouring into my life, people from this church pouring into my life in a way that you never saw, so many people here never saw. They did it. They didn't ask God any questions. They just did it. And Mr. Henna just did it. They didn't have to do that. When I was a kid looking through the door of that closet, saying, God, where are you? God started in 1950 to answer that prayer. I didn't know that he had been working this thing out in 1950 to where that place would be there for me at my time of need when I became a young man at the children's home at 12 years old. I didn't understand that that's how it worked. Since then, I've seen God move over and over and over again. And I get an opportunity to come and say thank you on behalf of all the kids that were served at that children's home. Now the ministry has changed a lot. The campus program is no longer there. And what happened was a lot of state regulation came down to where it was no longer going to be a home. It was going to become a facility. And that was never Mr. and Mrs. Henna's vision for that place. As a matter of fact, Mr. Henna was on the youth commission, and he traveled all over the state of Texas looking at places and seeing facilities and saying, this is not what I want. This won't make the difference that needs to be made. So now we focus on a ministry that I keep thinking of it as new, but this ministry's been around since 1978, and it's the family care ministry. And it's single moms and their kids come into the children's home, and they work to get these moms back on their feet. What is the similarity between those moms' situation and my situation as a kid? They know they need the place. They come in knowing that they need the place. So many kids went there as young people, and it was a punishment. It was presented as a punishment to me. What my mom didn't know the day that she placed me there was that my grandmother had driven me past that chapel at the children's home since I was a little kid, telling me that she was going to take me there and put me up for adoption. So the day that I went there, of course, I was scared to death. And I didn't know how God was going to use that place. Of course, I run into the house parents that would end up being the example of a husband and a father and somebody who loves the Lord. I saw that, and I finally had that modeled to me by somebody. But now we have these moms that come in, again, knowing the place. They know that they need it. And, it's an honor to work for these folks because they're not asking us to do anything for them. They're just saying, hey, if you'll show us how to do it, we'll do it ourselves. And so we walk alongside them. We teach them how to budget. We teach them how to do their finances. We put them in counseling. We counsel their kids. We share the gospel with them, and those lives are being changed on a daily basis at the children's home. And again, none of that happens without people like you coming and serving with your time, talent, and treasure, like Pastor Jonathan coming in church, serving on our board with his talent of leadership. The financial side, there's those big things where somebody gives a gift like the property of the children's home. I had the honor of meeting Lewis Henna Jr., and it was the first time that anybody had been invited to his home. And it was right after I first got back to the children's home. And so I go, and as I'm talking to him, it hits me the impact of his family on my life. And I teared up, and I was embarrassed because I'm not emotional, but goodness gracious, man, sometimes it just feels like I'm emotional all the time when I think about what God has done in my life. But with him, it hit me the impact of his gift on my life and his family's gift on my life. And I said that to him. I said, Mr. Henna, your mom and dad didn't see me in 1950. They didn't know that every good thing in my life would come from seeds that they would plant in the ground in the middle of Round Rock. And so that was that big gift. And then I was talking to his sister, Ruthie. And Ruthie is an amazing woman. And we were talking about the history of the children's home. And she, I knew she needed some encouragement. So I said, hey, can I stop this for a second and just share something with you? And she said, sure. So I said, I was out sharing my testimony out in Stephenville at this little church. And before I got up to share my testimony, the pastor said, David, we have Vacation Bible School starting tonight. Nobody has signed up to help. And I was like, okay. So I shared my testimony. I get to the end of my testimony. And I said, when I was a kid at the children's home, there was somebody that was at every single event. And I didn't know their importance to the organization. All I knew was that they knew my name, they hugged my neck, and they made me feel special when I didn't think I was special to anybody. And there's going to be a kid that may come through the door of this church tonight, and it may be that kid that nobody wants to deal with, that's hard-headed, but if you're just kind to that kid, that's the kid that may never forget you for being kind to them. And I said, Ruthie, it was you. And I was able to give that gift of her kindness. Now, she was just being her. But the thing about it was she was being her and being present somewhere where God could use that gift of her kindness in somebody's life like mine. And, when I think about having the opportunity to try to motivate people in this church and all of the churches around the area, just go be present. If you can't give financially, go be present. There are people that need you. There's somebody like me, I promise you, there's somebody like me that's out there praying, God, where are you? And I never understood that. I was at this little meeting, and it was called Generous Giving, and I was with a bunch of other givers that we were watching this video, and at the end, they asked everybody, what did you get from this? And I will listen to everybody and what they heard from that video, but what I heard was, this is where it all starts. It all starts in a place like this where somebody's heart gets touched to do something special, and there's somebody like me at 5 years old praying, God, where are you? And then somebody choosing to do whatever it is that God is laying on their heart to do. So I know that Pastor Jonathan has Missions Month coming up, and this is something that's important. Our important thing, and Deanna will tell you, we want you to go where your heart's at. We're not the only show in town. Texas Baptist Children's Home is not the only show in town. There's a million great places to serve that need your help. So wherever it is, whatever moves your heart, go do it. When I think about the generational changes that were made in my life, it was generational. It didn't start, my generation of my family was going in no direction whatsoever. And I was so scared. Now, it blows my mind because I was so scared to be a dad, but now I have 2 biological children that are 19 and 23, and then 3 adopted children. And Got two more recently that were young and showed me, I was telling Pastor Jonathan how old they made me feel at 50 when I saw all that energy running through the house. But that was something that, as I was sitting in my home, and my two oldest kids had moved out, and I'm looking at this and I'm like, I didn't do anything to earn this home. Who am I to hold on to this? And now this was one of those things I was telling you about. My wife had asked me, hey, can we maybe adopt again? And I was like, no, we're not doing that. And she did the exact same thing I did to her, where she just let it sit and let it sit. And about 3 months later, she starts getting a text of all of these children that needed homes. And we found 2 little girls that needed a home, and we got recertified. And of course, that was how that worked. She did the same thing. She pulled the same trick on me that I played on her a few years ago. But for somebody to be so scared, and I'm sitting at my home and I look and I see these 2 empty rooms in my home, knowing that we could do more, and knowing that there was somebody out there that probably needed one of those rooms, and didn't realize it was going to be both of those rooms, but it ended up needing one of those rooms. And so that was where the Lord moved my heart. And something I don't always share at places, because I want people to understand that impact of generations, right? That this is generation. I don't always share this, but I will share it today. And I've shared this a million times in the past, but for me, it was such a legacy thing to hear this. So my son wrote me in 2019, right after I started this job, on my birthday, October 12th, almost a year ago. And so this was a message that he sent me. He said, Dad, I don't even know where to start, so I guess I'll start by saying I love you so much. You're my best friend, my mentor, my biggest role model. I want to be just like you. Man, I've read this a million times. It never gets easier. You're one of the most honest, straightforward, passionate, selfless, protective, caring individuals I've ever met. You're a provider. You're one of the only people I know that can tell stories and everybody would stop to listen. You're thoughtful. You're wise. You're a leader. You're an amazing husband and father. I want to be just like you. I can't begin to express how much you mean to me. I know I'm not perfect, but all I want to do is make you proud. You've made some big shoes for me to fill, but gosh, when I think about our family, I'm proud to be a Gillian. That doesn't happen without people like y'all. That's just the truth. So again, please just go out wherever the Lord is leading you, wherever the Lord is moving your heart, and go be present. Be willing, just be open. Just be open. And if you don't know where that's at today, if you think that God is done with you, I thought God was done with me too. When I left being a house parent at the children's home, I thought it was over. And because I went and finished my degree in social work, I was off making money doing other things. And I made the mistake. I say mistake. I was praying in the shower one day, and I'm like, Lord, is this all you have for me, is to make money for my family? 2 hours later, the president of the Texas Baptist Children's Home, who I had not talked to in 5 years, called me and asked me to come in and interview for this position. So I knew I was going to take a pay cut, but I knew that the Lord had made it clear that this was where I was supposed to be. So, of course, be careful what you pray for, because you may get it. But, when you're at home and when you're thinking about these things, please, just pray. Just ask God where his heart's at for you and where he can use you the most, because I promise you, I don't care if you're young, I don't care if you're old, the Lord is still here to you. You are still here. You still have purpose in his kingdom. And sometimes it's just as simple as being present. Sometimes it's giving financially, sometimes it's just giving your time. And that means a lot, and you have value to the kingdom of heaven. And I don't care how old you are. God uses you, and he's still looking to use you. So.